Hi, welcome to another episode of Cooking Politics. We are here at Lotus Maya in Tartu in Estonia, and today we will be talking about the far right and what can we expect of their agenda in the European Parliament or European Commission. We're joined today by our two guests, Stefano Braghiroli.
Thank you, welcome.
He's a lecturer at European Studies at the University of Tartu and also the director of the EURUS program. And also Wierenga. He's a junior researcher at the Shute Institute at the University of Tartu as well. And please tell us what we're going to be cooking today.
Actually, I will cook my probably favorite dish. It's a pasta. Mm-hmm. I decided to bring some Italian component, farfalle pasta, with a sauce which consists of rucola pesto. Mm-hmm. Here we have rucola and cashew and prawns. I will accompany it with a white wine from Georgia at Sinandali.
Oh, very good. And Luis,
I'm gonna make hamburgers, an American dish actually.
Okay.
Maybe it's making its way over to Europe now. And I'm cutting up. We'll have avocados on the buns, and then I've cut up jalapeno, onions, and garlic with the help of some students prior to the filming. And I'm going to embed that in the meat while I cook. So.
Okay. What are we talking about when we talk about the far right in Europe?
Usually it's a socio-cultural context now. The economic dimension is slowly escaping us in that respect. So it's usually, if we talk about borders, if we talk about nativism, which is xenophobic nationalism, which should be used more than the term populism. Usually when the term populism is used, what's really being talked about is nativism. Mm-hmm. And the far right in Europe is classified in a party family called the populist radical right, which combines populism and nativism, as I mentioned before, and authoritarianism.
Can we define nativism as well?
Xenophobic nationalism. It's xenophobic nationalism, so it's the idea that people, groups of people, or specific individuals, political elites, or even ideas such as multiculturalism or like minority rights is a threatening concept to the titular nation state.
Okay.
So you see that with some of the latest protests that have been going on in Estonia, for example.
Okay, for those who don't know, yesterday we have a couple of protests in Estonia where the youth center was trying to organize some LGBT supporting sessions for youth. And a group from a conservative party, ECRE, wanted to protest against it because they were saying this was like pandering to the youth of Estonia and against like the family values. So this would be, I guess, in the field of multiculturalism or something like this.
It would be, but multiculturalism or liberal democracy, for example, because some people want to say extreme right, and in political science we categorize the extreme right and the radical right as being different. Because the radical right is opposed to liberal democracy, but not democracy. They're not advocating for some kind of anti-democratic force, whereas extreme right, they're usually groups, not parties, don't like democracy at all. Okay. So that's why you see power to the people, usually referendums, for example. The radical right like referendums because everything can be put forward to the people for a vote, for example.
So participative democracy, a bit against the democratic system itself.
Exactly.
Okay. So, Stefano, from your experience, what, do you think like this far-right surge that we've been seeing in Europe for the last few years would happen the same way if we didn't have this migration crisis in 2015?
No, I mean, for sure it wouldn't happen the same way, but it happened anyway.
Yes.
So we already have examples of the far right much earlier than the refugee crisis, and especially if we refer to the 2015 refugee crisis following the so-called Balkan route and so on and so forth. So in fact, what we can say is that the refugee crisis, as much as, for example, what Lewis mentioned, the debate on LGBT values and so on and so forth, these are just triggers that to a certain extent, let's say, empower a certain type of debate. But if we look at what are the determinants that to a certain extent, let's say, favor the emergence of the far right or again of the nativist movements, well, again, there we need to look at other dimensions, I believe. One is the economic factor. I mean, if we look at the voters, for example, of the far right in most of the European context, we look at people that have a lower level of education, less economic opportunities, and somehow tend to be more marginal, either in terms of living in the countryside or living maybe in the peripheries, and so on and so forth. That's one part of the story. The other one, of course, could be that these people are somehow looking at the elites, at who governs us, as distant.
Okay.
They think that their voice is not heard. They think that their voice, to a certain extent, is, let's say, just muted by other interests. Let's say the big corporations, again, other types of elites, and so on and so forth. So they feel frustrated. And in that sense, of course, if you add the refugees, well, then the dynamics become, our voice is not only not heard, but the government takes more care of the refugees than of us.
Okay.
And of course, on the other hand, when we talk about dimensions such as Europe, well, Europe makes the government even more distant. To many people, let's say, relating to the government is already something quite far away. Yeah. Brussels is ear light away. So in that respect, these dynamics, again, the refugee crisis or the debate on, again, multiculturalism, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth, have increased, to a certain extent, the voice of the far right. But the far right in terms of value-based and in terms of somehow proposing an alternative existed much earlier than that. And to a certain extent, we can say that what induces the emergence of the far right is this challenge of yourself, of your identity. Nowadays we can see that, there is this kind of gap between, let's say, openness and closeness, if you want to say, let's say, materialist and post-materialist values. And when you see that your values are somehow under threat, and let's say a party of the nation come to say, I'm here for you, let's fight back, let's close our doors, let's build our walls. Well, this is where somehow the far right proliferates.
And it brings us to another question of us.
I can hang on.
The cleavage here between the far right in Western Europe and the far right in Eastern Europe.
Well, I can say, okay, so I'll make my second point first with regards to the last question, and that the economic factor for voting for the radical right is not as clear-cut as many think, because the radical right has done very well in countries in Scandinavia, which have generous welfare states, and where salaries are a bit higher, and they have usually not done so well in Southern Europe, especially after the Great Recession. Only recently has Spain got a far-right party, they're called Vox. And so what the literature tells us is that a lot of the radical right voters are either what we call losers of globalization or losers of the transition. Not the nice term, I don't like to use it as an insult, but people who have not, let's say, benefited from Europeanization, and in Central and Eastern Europe, those who haven't benefited from the transition. But those are the radical right voters, not the population at large. And so what Stefano was saying about when a party comes to say, we will be your voice because these are the problems, there's a lot of interlinkage. So if you look at populism being sort of anti-elitism, well, why are people anti-elitism, or what is the narrative that's driving it? Well, it's an unelected commission in Brussels, and our elected, whether it be in, say, Budapest, Prague, Tallinn, Riga, wherever, the capital city where the parliament is, they just are subservient to Brussels, and these are the people that are ruining your life. Basically.
So we could maybe say that the elite idea itself, it's kind of broken between the local level and the EU level. Like, for example, we have Viktor Orban in Hungary that has been in power for a really long time. But we could say it's part of the elite of that country now.
Well, that's where we have the term populism from above to explain this kind of phenomenon, because you're absolutely right. How would somebody who is using this, well, I would say Viktor Orban is a far-right actor after the refugee crisis, and that Fidesz really highlights something important, which is the difference between far-right politics and far-right parties, because they're competing with the largest opposition, Jobbik, which is actually a far-right party. Now, in terms of your question about the cleavages between Central East Europe and Western Europe, it's usually national minorities, language policy. It has been Russian speakers here in the Baltics, and the Visegrad countries, for example, it's been Roma or Jewish people. And then prior to the refugee crisis, there was really no large group from outside of Europe coming in. And in many cases, if you look at the Baltics, there's still not a large group coming in. It's just that there is the possibility.
Even the one that came left.
Exactly. And so With Hungary, it's a bit different because that was along the route, so they actually had to militarize the border and deploy police and military.
Is there any other like reasons that you both can identify that are sort of like stoking the flames of the far right movement in Europe today?
Well, corruption, which
Yeah.
ironically is also coming back to bite Viktor Orban, but initially that was working the other way around. And I think in Estonia, what I realized the 2015 election was that EKRE at this time was a new party. It was something that wasn't reform, and it wasn't Keskerakond, the center party. So it was something new, something that wasn't seemingly a far-right party at the time.
Yeah, in that sense, I think that, yeah, the idea of the corrupted elites that somehow sell our country away, in a way, this discourse that relates broadly to the dimension of sovereignty, but simply, let's say, they sell out for a cheap price what we have fought for. Again, think of the reacquisition of Estonian independence and so on and so forth. So this plays a very kind of emotional role. And of course, yes, corruption, but corruption in a broader term, in a sense like the elites, in a way, it's still like an anti-elitist discourse. I mean, the elites are by definition corrupt because they tend to distance themselves from the people. And one thing that there I would really connect is that this broader discourse on corruption relates also to dimensions of social inequality. In some contexts, especially, again, take Central and Eastern Europe, take the Baltic and so on and so forth, there has been a lot of stress somehow on economic development, or somehow, take the Baltics, the e-paradise, the startup, the e-country. But when it comes to somehow, the ones left behind, well, most of the establishment parties, the Social Democrats, the liberal parties and so on, have been quite ineffective in really addressing the social gap. And then comes EKRE that says, well, in a way, we are here to take care of you and to implement policies that can take care of the nation, of course, excluding the ones that are not part of the nation. And one thing, again, that I want to mention with respect to what Lewis mentioned, yes, I mean, minorities are in a way a part of the exclusion-inclusion discourse. But if you see also how the dynamics change, I mean, the far right in contexts like, again, the Baltics, take again Estonia, for example, in which generally, again, there has been an ethnic approach to the definition of what the nation is. Well, what we have witnessed following the emergence and somehow the consolidation of the debate on the refugees and refugee crisis is that increasingly the far right has tried to approach the Russian-speaking minorities and to try to involve them into their discourse with, I would say, varying degree of success. But I mean, clearly the effort is there.
And going back to for example, this particular thing about the Russian-speaking population, we've seen a lot in the media that they try to establish a link between Russian government efforts and the far right in Europe. Is that like a credible link that we can establish?
I think maybe if it's credible, it's overblown a bit.
Okay.
I think the real Trojan horses of Putin in Europe are people like Silvio Berlusconi and Gerhard Schroeder, people who can, maybe you could say Viktor Orban, who does also fit into the far right, because they're people who can get things done. I mean, Orban has the backing of EPP, and it is very likely he wouldn't have been able to push through the radical right agenda in Hungary had it not been for the backing of Nancy Weber and Joseph Daul. So I think that's where the real issue lies in terms of Russia. However, most parties, EKRE is not one of them actually, neither is the National Alliance or Peace in Poland, are pro-Russia because they see Putin as kind of the embodiment of a far-right strongman, however incorrect that might be, because some of his critics on the far right say he's just another globalist, he's just not the same as Western NATO-style globalists.
If I may add here, yes, I agree with you is that in fact let's say, if you mention Silvio Berlusconi, Schroeder, or other mainstream party leaders of national parties are more useful to Russia than somehow the so-called Russlandversteher like the far right. There I have to completely agree. I mean, why? Because these leaders are and have been in government. So they've also been able to deliver. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that, let's say, for example, Salvini, Marine Le Pen, and let's say Alternative für Deutschland are not very close to the Kremlin in terms not only of narrative but also of policies that they promote. If you look, for example, at the voting records in the European Parliament, of the current parliament and of the previous one, these three parties that I mentioned have consistently and always voted in favor of pro-Russia positions in the votes in the parliament. All of them have an agreement, a stated agreement with United Russia, and I would even argue, at least one interesting thing that I noticed myself, the far right has always an issue in the European Parliament. It is somehow to create a cohesive, united group in the parliament. As we know, the far right support has increased, and in fact, in the European Parliament, there are more far right MEPs and far right legislators. The problem is how good are they in sticking together? And I would say that the group that Salvini created and started, started with the goal of becoming a very important stakeholder in the parliament, up to the third largest group. That was the goal of Salvini. In fact, by now is the fifth. So the point, and not because there are not enough members from the far right, but because some of them didn't join the group. And as Lewis correctly said, if you take, for example, the Polish PIS, or if you take the Latvian National Alliance, well, there is one reason why these parties didn't join the group, which is that that group was perceived to be as too close to the Kremlin interest. In that sense, I would say that ECRE is probably the most interesting case of the member of that group, because it's the only party that in fact has a quite critical stance toward Russia, but joined in fact a group which is very much pro-Russia.
Okay.
So yeah, that I think it's one of the determining factors of who joined the group in the European Parliament, the Salvini-led group. And the ones who didn't is indeed the perceived pro-Russia stance of that group.
That brings to another question. Like, we've seen this happen in the EU Parliament and the EU Commission and national governments in the past. And now, after the EU parliamentary elections and the new EU Commission, what are the things that we can expect of the far right?
I mean, what I would say is that in the European Parliament, the key issue is whether they manage indeed to stick together. As of now, the fifth group in the Parliament can't achieve much by itself. And of course, the problem with the effectiveness of a far-right group is that very often it fails to get alliances and coalitions in the Parliament because of this pariah effect to a certain extent. So the question is, how well do they manage to at least involve other like-minded parties, such as, again, the Hungarians of Fidesz, the Poles of Law and Justice, and other parties that maybe are in the inscript, and so on and so forth. That's one part of the story. When it comes to the Commission, I think that the impact in the College of Commissioners itself might be relatively limited. Because in fact there has been a kind of, as you just mentioned, a process of vetting who gets in. In the end, Hungary proposed one first commissioner, which in fact was excluded, not even on ideological reasons, but just for reasons related to conflict of interest, not necessarily high level of transparency. But then we saw that Hungary in the end went for an easier solution. They proposed the Hungarian ambassador to the EU. So in a way, they tried to kind of, diffuse down the tension. The key problem, I think, is not inside the Commission, but is in the relationship of the Commission with the Parliament. Okay. Meaning that the Commission has probably the thinnest majority ever had by a Commission vis-à-vis the European Parliament. So the fact that the far right is on board or not relates not to the policies the Commission proposes, but to the effectiveness of the Commission to push ahead its agenda.
Okay. Louis, would you care to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, it's hard to tell, and historically, every time the far right tries to create a supergroup in the European Union, it doesn't really go very well. The ENF, the previous Le Pen-Wilders group, was kind of a financial success but a political failure. There are some signs that the new Salvini group won't be as, they might be more successful, and the reason being is because they actually decided to put their differences aside because the most important thing for them is to secure Europe's borders, and that is one of the reasons why I think ECRE joined, because the Dansk Folkeparti joined, although I think one of the members lost their seat, Anders Christensen. And so you have kind of a large far-right group that previously would have had people from parties that would not have worked together. and now they're going to. So I think we couldn't expect more. Then, as Stefano correctly mentioned, the problem would be who's going to work together from outside. And I think although the far right has several MEPs from non-inscrits, they're kind of irrelevant. So it would look for Fidesz and the EPP. I think the ECR won't really do much. I mean, long.
Are we seeing a little change? Are we seeing a little going back into the liberal fold slowly at least?
I mean, yes and no. One of the things you might have to look at is really it's a national context. So one of the true powers of the radical right is their ability to get competitors to talk about their issues and sometimes to adopt their issues. And as we have been mentioning, when parties are in power that have the experience, they're usually able to execute the agenda much more. Now, in terms of Hungary, that's a little different because yes, there's sort of a chink in the armor, a chink in the Fidesz armor, but that's the capital. That's where the largest opposition always has been. And you do have left-wing groups teaming up with Jobbik, for example, the far right, because that's the only thing they can really get Orban on is in corruption.
So it's either Orban with his far right or Jobbik with extreme right.
Exactly, but Jobbik is now modernized, so they are.
True.
If you look at what they say now and what they said previously, it's almost two completely different parties, and they've also had a lot of people leave to our homeland movement, which is a very, very far-right party. So I think what is happening is that it's a similar situation to Slovakia, that there is kind of a powerful voice that comes from, dare I say, the people, but it's up to political parties to channel that opposition and say it's an uphill battle for the Fidesz opposition in Hungary. They'll have to win outside of Budapest. And because of the changes Orban has implemented, he's made it very hard for other parties to compete. So for food, my burgers, this is the first time I've made them not on the barbecue, so apologies if they have not turned out as expected. But
fine.
hopefully quick and hasty. I've prepared some guacamole from the avocado, but that goes on the bun. Yours looks...
My food, well, again, first of all, this means that we are cooking live. That's already a good message for everyone. Now, basically, what we are going to do, we are going to mix the prawns and the tomato sauce that somehow has been made out of cherry tomatoes with the rucola pesto. Which is made out of Cheshire, Parmigiano Reggiano, not Parmesan, and rucola, fresh rucola. It is a very important difference.
Just as a type of pasta, because it's not macaroni.
It's not, and thank you for raising it, because somehow one of the goals of today's discussion, which has been very much highlighted by this apron, is that I would like indeed to highlight that in Italy, we tend to be very much protective about the different types of pasta that we have. And as you can see here, pasta is the overall...
It's like the party family.
Is the party family. And basically, the different types of pasta constitute all the national parties. We have farfalle, which is the one that we're going to eat today. We have agnolotti, we have tortiglioni, we have spaghetti, and so on and so forth. So in fact, using the definition of macaroni or macaronid, it's actually incorrect because that refers to only one type of pasta.
So in the world, in the party family of pasta, which one would be the far right?
Which one would be the far right? Probably spaghetti, I would say.
Values.
Yeah, they are traditional values, exactly.
Very good. Well, I think we're basically done with the food. I think Stefano is pretty much ready. Louis definitely is ready. This has been a great conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks to you.
Thanks for having us.
It's an interesting topic and it's very contemporary, and I think we still can talk much more about this. You can always find the recipes for the hamburgers and the farfalle carbonara pesto.
No. Farfalle with the prawns and rucola pesto.
Prawns and rucola pesto. Recipe in the description below, and well, give it some thumbs up if you like, and share, and thank you for watching.
Thank you so much, and bon appetit.
Right there.